Hey guys, tonight we're going on a journey not through a battlefield or a royal court, but into the minds of some of the most influential people who ever lived, the ancient Greek philosophers. Forget what you think you know from high school textbooks. We're not talking about dusty old men with beards lecturing from stone podiums. We're stepping into their world, feeling the dust on their sandals, smelling the olive oil, and hearing the buzzing of flies as they argued about the nature of reality itself. We're going to see how they actually, live the strange, often uncomfortable, and sometimes outright bizarre daily lives they led in pursuit of wisdom. This wasn't a cozy academic life with a pension plan. It was a full contact sport for the soul. Frankly, a modern person dropped into their shoes would probably last about a day. You'd be hungry, itchy, and deeply confused by the lack of internet. You'd likely get a nasty case of dysentery from the communal water supply and be utterly bewildered by the fact that the most respected man in town might be walking around barefoot, wearing the same tunic for a year. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the bustling heart of Athens in the 5th century BCE. The city is a vibrant, chaotic organism, a tangle of narrow streets and sun-bleached marble. The air smells of sweat bread and the sea. You, a young Athenian, find yourself drawn to a man who doesn't fit in. He's not a wealthy merchant in a fine chiton, nor is he a powerful politician. He's short, snub-nosed with bulging eyes and a paunch that jiggles when he walks. He is Socrates, and he is utterly infuriatingly brilliant. He doesn't have a school or a lecture hall. His classroom is the agora, the public square. You see him there day in and day out, not selling goods but selling ideas, or rather giving them away for free like an intellectual street vendor. You watch as he cornered a prominent politician, a man of great reputation and self-assurance. The politician begins to speak of justice, of what it means to be a good leader. You expect Socrates to nod along to show deference. Instead, he begins to ask questions, gentle at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves. Tell me, my friend, what is justice? Is it giving to each what is due? The politician, flattered, agrees. But what if what is due is a sword to a madman? Is it still just to give him what is due? A tiny crack appears in the politician's facade. The breeze turns into a gale and Socrates' questions get sharper, more relentless. What about piety? What is goodness? What is knowledge? The politician stammers, his face grows red. In a matter of minutes, this man of great standing has been shown to be intellectually naked, his supposed wisdom nothing more than an empty shell. This is the Socratic method, and you are witnessing it firsthand. It's a method not of giving answers, but of forcing others to find the flaws in their own thinking. The philosopher, in this sense, isn't a sage on a mountain, but a midwife helping to birth new ideas from the mind of another. A funny detail Socrates himself said, he knew nothing which made him the wisest man in Athens, at least according to the oracle at Delphi. Imagine being famous for admitting you don't know anything. It's a level of humility that's pretty rare even today. His daily life was one of radical simplicity, a philosophical choice in itself. While others wore fine cloaks and sandals, Socrates went around barefoot, often in the same threadbare garment, no matter the weather. You might see him shivering in the winter chill, but he would simply pull his cloak tighter and continue his argument. This wasn't because he was poor, though he wasn't wealthy either, but because he believed that a man's worth was in his mind and his character, not in his possessions. He was an early minimalist, a man who found joy in deprivation. One time, walking through a marketplace filled with an endless array of goods, he supposedly remarked, "How many things I can do without—" This wasn't a lament, it was a triumphant declaration. He saw that the pursuit of material wealth was a kind of slavery, and he was the freest man in Athens. His meals were simple, too. He wasn't a gourmand. He'd eat whatever was available, often just bread and olives, and he'd drink water or watered-down wine. He would often fast not for religious reasons, but to sharpen his mind and prove to himself that he was not a slave to his bodily desires. You might walk past him and see him standing perfectly still for hours lost in thought, a statue of contemplation amidst the chaos of the city. He would simply stop mid-stride and meditate on a problem sometimes for an entire day until he had reached a conclusion. This was his version of a deep work session, and it was a common sight for his students and the citizens of Athens. This level of mental discipline seems almost alien to us now, accustomed as we are to constant stimulation and distraction. Socrates' home life was equally unconventional. He had a wife, Xanthippe, who has gone down in history as a notoriously difficult, nagging woman. Historical sources portray her as constantly complaining about Socrates' lack of income and his habit of spending his days talking philosophy instead of providing for his family. This has led to the stereotype of the long-suffering wife of a genius. But you have to wonder from Xanthippe's perspective what it was like to be married to a man who literally didn't care about money, who had no job, and who brought home no paycheck. From a modern viewpoint, she probably just wanted to pay the bills and keep the kids fed, which seems pretty reasonable. Was she really a shrew or just a pragmatic woman trying to survive? Historians still debate whether Xanthippe's portrayal is a fair one or if it was simply a convenient caricature created by male philosophers to contrast with the idealized, detached life of the male intellectual. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but it's a good reminder that every story has at least two sides. Socrates' life was not a series of quiet reflections, however. He was a veteran soldier, a man who had served with distinction in several battles, including the grueling campaign at Potidaea. You would have seen him on the battlefield not just fighting, but saving the life of his student Alcibiades, a man who would later become a controversial figure in Athenian politics. Socrates was known for his incredible endurance, his ability to march barefoot in the snow, and to withstand cold and hunger better than any of his comrades. This physical toughness was not separate from his philosophy. It was a testament to his belief that a philosopher must master both the mind and the body, that true freedom comes from not being a slave to either. He was a man of action as much as he was a man of thought, a rare combination that made him all the more compelling. The climax of Socrates' life, as you know, was his trial. He was accused of two things corrupting the youth and impiety that is failing to respect the city's gods. The first charge came from the fact that his constant questioning led young men to challenge their elders and the established order. The second charge was a political tool, a way to silence a man who had become a thorn in the side of the city's elite. You would have been there in the courtroom watching as he defended himself, not by begging for mercy, but by standing his ground by insisting that he was a gift from the gods to the city, a gadfly sent to sting a lazy horse into action. The trial was not a fight for his life. It was a final, uncompromising defense of his way of life. The fact that the verdict was decided by a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, a popular vote, highlights the precarious nature of intellectual freedom in a direct democracy. After he was convicted, he was given the choice of exile or death. He could have chosen to leave Athens and live out his days in a foreign land. Instead, he chose to die. He said that a philosopher should not fear death, as it was either an eternal sleep or a journey to a better place. You would have heard the story of his final moments surrounded by his weeping friends and students as he calmly drank the cup of hemlock. His last words famously were to his friend Crito. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay the debt and do not forget." Asclepius was the god of healing, and this final strange remark has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some say he meant that death was the ultimate cure for the sickness of life. Others say it was simply a mundane task he wanted done, a final act of respect to a god he was accused of not honoring. The fact that his final moments were spent on a philosophical riddle rather than a plea for his life is the most Socratic thing he could have done. His legacy wasn't a set of books, he never wrote anything down. His legacy was an endless stream of questions and a whole generation of thinkers he inspired. His student Plato would go on to be the one to write down his teachings and preserve his memory. Plato, a man from an aristocratic family, was so deeply affected by Socrates' death that he would dedicate his life to creating a system of thought that could prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. He saw that a world without Socrates was a darker, more ignorant place, and he set out to build a new one. This new world, this new way of life would take the form of an institution, the first of its kind, and it would be called the Academy. But that's a story for another time. For now, you can close your eyes and imagine the barefoot philosopher, still asking questions, still a living paradox in the dusty streets of ancient Athens. You're standing in a different part of Athens now, a quieter, more serene place than the bustling agora. The air is filled not with the clamor of merchants, but with the rustling of olive leaves and the distant chirping of cicadas. You have followed in the footsteps of Plato, a wealthy young aristocrat who, after the execution of his teacher Socrates, was profoundly disillusioned with Athenian politics and democracy. He saw how the very system that promised freedom had condemned the wisest man he knew. He resolved to create a new kind of space, a sanctuary for thought, a place where the pursuit of truth could flourish unthreatened by the whims of the crowd. This place was the Academy. It wasn't a building in the way we think of one today. Imagine an olive grove just outside the city walls dedicated to the hero Academus. In this sacred grove amidst the trees and the gentle sounds of nature, Plato established his school. This was the world's first university, a true innovation. It was a place for men to live and study together, a community dedicated to intellectual and spiritual growth. The atmosphere wasn't one of rigid lectures and rote memorization. It was a fluid, dynamic environment of dialogue, debate, and discovery, a direct evolution of Socrates' method. You might walk through the grove and see a group of men wrestling in a courtyard, a physical discipline they believed was essential for mental fortitude. Nearby, another group would be tracing geometric shapes in the dirt with sticks, their heads bent in intense concentration. Plato believed that the study of geometry, with its perfect, unchanging forms, was the gateway to understanding the eternal forms that he theorized existed beyond our physical world. A funny thing about this, the school's motto was said to be, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." It's like a bouncer for a nightclub, but instead of checking your ID, they're checking if you know the Pythagorean theorem. Life in the academy was structured, but not oppressive. The students who came from across the Greek world weren't just learning, they were living. Their days were a mix of intellectual pursuits and physical training. Meals were taken together simple and nourishing, fostering a sense of community. The philosophical discussions weren't confined to a classroom. They happened everywhere, while they ate, while they exercised, while they walked. The goal was to integrate philosophy into every aspect of life, to make it a way of being, not just a subject of study. The curriculum was broad, encompassing not just philosophy, but also mathematics, astronomy, and biology. Plato saw these disciplines not as separate subjects, but as different paths leading to the same destination, a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it. This holistic approach was a radical departure from the more specialized training of the sophists who taught rhetoric for a fee. Plato's philosophy, which he developed in his writings and dialogues, was the central pillar of the Academy's teachings. You would have been immersed in his theory of forms. Imagine that the chair you are sitting on right now is just an imperfect copy of a perfect, eternal, and unchanging form of chairness that exists in a different reality. The beautiful sunset you saw yesterday is just a pale imitation of the ultimate form of beauty. Plato taught that the physical world we see and touch is just a shadow, a fleeting reflection of a more real, perfect world of forms. The goal of the philosopher then was to use reason to transcend the sensory world and grasp these ultimate truths. This was the journey you would have been on at the Academy, a journey from the shadows of a cave to the blinding light of the sun, as he famously described in his allegory of the cave. Living and learning in the Academy meant a certain kind of life. It required discipline, a rejection of the fleeting pleasures of the body in favor of the lasting joys of the mind. Plato himself was a vegetarian, a choice rooted in his philosophical beliefs about the soul and the transmigration of souls. He believed that the body was a kind of prison for the soul, and that the best life was one that prepared the soul for its eventual release. This wasn't a life of grim asceticism, but one of deliberate moderation. They still drank wine, but it was watered down. They still enjoyed companionship, but it was centered on intellectual conversation, not drunken revelry. You would have felt a sense of purpose there, a shared mission to uncover the fundamental truths of existence. The Academy was not a monastery, however. It was a dynamic intellectual hub where ideas were not just absorbed but challenged. The greatest challenge came from within. The most brilliant student to ever walk through the academy's gates was a young man from Macedon named Aristotle. He spent nearly 20 years as a student and then a teacher there, absorbing Plato's ideas but also questioning them relentlessly. He was a meticulous observer of the natural world, a biologist and a logician who found the abstract, otherworldly nature of Plato's forms unsatisfying. A classic academic argument, really the kind that still happens in universities today. One professor wants to talk about the ideal form of a dog, and another wants to go outside and dissect one to see how it actually works. Aristotle would go on to develop his own philosophy, one that was grounded in the empirical world, a philosophy that would eventually lead him to found his own school and challenge the very foundations of the Academy's teachings. The Academy also had a surprisingly lasting impact on politics. Plato believed that the ideal society would be ruled by philosopher kingsmen trained in reason and justice. His students were often men of political ambition, and they were trained not just in theory, but in how to apply these ideas to the practical world of governance. Several of his students went on to become advisors to rulers, and some even founded their own colonies based on Platonic principles. This was the ultimate goal: to make the world a better place, not through force, but through wisdom. The ideal of the philosopher as a public servant, a man who uses his intellect to improve society, was a core tenet of the Academy. However, this also led to one of the most enduring academic debates. Are philosophers meant to be in the ivory tower contemplating abstract truths? Or are they meant to be out in the world, getting their hands dirty with the messy business of politics? The Academy tried to bridge that gap, but the tension between the two roles remains a source of discussion even now. An interesting and little-known fact about the Academy is that it was not just a place for men. While the majority of students were male, there is some evidence to suggest that women may have been allowed to participate at least in certain capacities. One of Plato's students, Axiothea of Phlius, is said to have studied there disguised as a man. Another, Lasthenia of Mantinea, also studied at the Academy. While their presence was likely not a widespread phenomenon, the fact that they were there at all speaks to a more open-minded intellectual environment than was typical for ancient Greece. It's a fascinating detail that challenges the traditional narrative of a purely male-dominated philosophical world. The Academy would eventually close its doors not a few decades later, but nearly 1,000 years later, in 529 CE by the Roman Emperor Justinian. It was a testament to its enduring influence, an intellectual beacon that shone for a millennium. But for now, as you walk through the olive grove, you feel a sense of profound purpose. You are not just learning, you are building something new, something that will outlast the empires and the politicians. You are part of an intellectual lineage that began with a barefoot man in the agora and is now taking shape in this quiet garden, a lineage that will continue to challenge, to question, and to seek the truth for generations to come. The man who will take it in a new direction is already among you, a young man from the north, with a curious mind and a passion for observing the world as it is. His name is Aristotle, and his story is just beginning. The olive grove of the Academy has receded into the background, and you find yourself in a new school founded by a man who was once its star pupil. This is the Lyceum, and its founder is Aristotle. Unlike Plato's quiet, contemplative grove, the Lyceum is a place of bustling intellectual activity, a buzzing beehive of observation and classification. Aristotle, a student of Plato for 20 years, loved and respected his teacher, but he found the focus on the abstract world of forms to be insufficient. He wanted to understand the world you could see, touch, and measure. He wanted to know how things actually worked, not how they were supposed to be in some ideal realm. So he built a school that reflected this new approach, a school that was in its own way the first scientific research center. The Lyceum was known as the Peripatetic School, a name that comes from the Greek word peripatos, meaning to walk about. This is no accident. The school's defining feature was its covered walkway, or peripatos, and it was here that Aristotle and his students did their most important work. The classes weren't lectures in the modern sense. You would find yourself walking with a group of students following Aristotle as he strolled along the colonnaded paths, talking and gesturing, using the physical world around him to illustrate his points. Imagine discussing biology while examining a plant, or debating ethics while observing the behavior of people in the marketplace. The act of walking was an integral part of the learning process. It was thought to stimulate the mind and help with the flow of ideas. It's a method that sounds wonderfully simple and refreshing compared to sitting in a classroom, and it highlights a key difference between the Lyceum and the Academy. One was about contemplating the heavens, the other was about understanding the earth. Aristotle's daily life was one of relentless intellectual inquiry. He was a man of immense curiosity, and his interests were encyclopedic. You would have seen him surrounded by his students, not just discussing philosophy, but dissecting animals to understand their anatomy, collecting and classifying plants, and meticulously documenting the constitutions of hundreds of Greek city-states. He was a voracious reader and collector of knowledge, and the Lyceum housed one of the first great libraries of the ancient world. You might have been tasked with helping to transcribe a new finding or to add a scroll to the growing collection. The air in the Lyceum was filled with the scent of papyrus ink and the earthy smells of the specimens they studied. He was in many ways the world's first research scientist, and his work laid the foundation for disciplines from biology to logic. The structure of the Lyceum reflected its founder's practicality. There were two main types of sessions. The first, the esoteric or inner teachings, were for advanced students and were highly technical and detailed. The second, the exoteric or outer teachings, were for a wider audience and were more general and accessible. This dual system allowed Aristotle to train a new generation of scholars while also engaging with the broader public. He believed that philosophy wasn't just for a select few, but had a practical application for all citizens. A funny little detail: he charged no tuition, though he was not a poor man. He funded the Lyceum himself, seeing it as a public good, which makes him the world's first philanthropist, in addition to being its first scientist. The philosophical and scientific work of the Lyceum was grounded in logic. Aristotle invented the formal study of logic, creating a system for analyzing arguments and drawing valid conclusions. This was a revolutionary tool, one that would become the foundation of all Western science and philosophy. You would have spent hours with your fellow students painstakingly diagramming syllogisms and identifying fallacies. It was a rigorous, almost mathematical discipline, and it was meant to be the intellectual armor that protected you from faulty reasoning. This was a direct legacy of Socrates' love of argument, but Aristotle gave it a formal structure and a set of rules. He was, in a way, giving the world the instruction manual for thinking. Aristotle's personal life was as unique as his professional one. He was not a native Athenian, but a resident alien, which meant he couldn't participate in politics. This gave him a unique perspective, allowing him to observe the Athenian state without the biases of a citizen. He had a wife, Pythias, and a daughter also named Pythias. His wife's death deeply affected him, and he later had a relationship with a woman named Herpyllis, with whom he had a son, Nicomachus, for whom his great work on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, is named. He was by all accounts a loving family man, a man who believed that happiness was not an abstract ideal but a practical state achieved through virtue and a good life lived in a good community. This was a contrast to the Socratic ideal of a man detached from worldly concerns. Aristotle saw no conflict between intellectual pursuits and a fulfilling family life. An interesting and little-known detail about Aristotle is his deep connection to Alexander the Great. For 3 years, Aristotle was Alexander's tutor, teaching the young prince not just philosophy, but also medicine, poetry, and the natural sciences. The king, as a student, was so influenced by his teacher that he later sent back biological specimens from his military campaigns across the known world for Aristotle to study. This collaboration between a philosopher and a conqueror is a testament to the broad appeal of Aristotle's thought. It's a pretty wild thought that a man who was busy conquering empires was also taking the time to send back exotic plants and animals to his old professor. However, despite his brilliant mind and his influential students, Aristotle's time in Athens was not without its challenges. After the death of Alexander the Great, there was a strong anti-Macedonian sentiment in the city. The same charges of impiety that had been leveled against Socrates were now aimed at Aristotle. Rather than face a similar fate, he famously said, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy," and fled the city. It's a sad but telling fact that even the greatest minds of the age could not escape the fickle nature of politics. This event highlights a recurring theme in the lives of these philosophers: the constant tension between the pursuit of truth and the often unreasonable demands of the state. It also brings us back to a debate that still exists today: should intellectuals flee from persecution, or should they stand their ground and face the consequences for the sake of their beliefs? As you walk the paths of the Lyceum, you feel the weight of his legacy. This is a place where philosophy and science are one and the same. You are learning to observe, to classify, to reason, and to argue. You are learning to see the world not as a shadow of a higher reality, but as a fascinating and complex thing in itself. You are learning from a man who wanted to understand everything from the movement of the stars to the way an acorn becomes an oak. This is a different kind of wisdom, one that is grounded in the material world, and it will change the course of human history. The scene shifts dramatically. You are no longer in the manicured gardens of an academy or the orderly walkways of a lyceum. You are in the heart of Athens, but you are deliberately on its fringes, a place where poverty and grime are a constant presence. You are following a man who has taken the Socratic ideal of a simple life to its most radical, and for many its most shocking conclusion. This man is Diogenes of Sinope, and he is the founder of the Cynic school of philosophy. The word cynic comes from the Greek word kynikos, which means dog-like. This was not meant as a compliment at first. Diogenes and his followers embraced the insult, however, and wore it as a badge of honor. They believed that just as dogs lived in the moment without shame or pretense, so too should humans. The Cynic ideal was to live a life in accordance with nature, stripping away all the artificial conventions of society, wealth, power, reputation, and even basic decency, as most Athenians understood it. You would have seen Diogenes himself living out this philosophy in the most literal way possible. His home wasn't a house or even a hut. It was a large ceramic storage jar, a pythos, which he had repurposed as his dwelling place in the agora. This jar was his entire world, his shelter from the rain and the sun. He owned nothing else but a simple tunic, a cloak, a staff, and a small satchel for a piece of bread and some olives. A day in the life of a cynic was a constant performance of their philosophy. You would have watched Diogenes begging for food, a humbling act that was meant to free him from the need for a job or a patron. He would eat and sleep wherever he could, often in public, completely unconcerned with what others thought. He would relieve himself in the streets, openly mocking the Athenian sense of propriety. He believed that all of these social taboos were just that, arbitrary social constructs that trapped people in a prison of shame and conformity. By flouting them, he was demonstrating a path to true freedom. A funny detail: he was once seen begging from a statue. When asked why, he replied, "To practice being refused." It's a perfect illustration of their philosophy finding value even in rejection and embracing hardship as a form of spiritual exercise. Diogenes' most famous act, however, was his search for an honest man. You would have seen him in the middle of the day, lamp in hand, peering intently into the faces of passers-by. When asked what he was doing, he would reply, "I am looking for a human being." He believed that the Athenians, with all their political posturing and social climbing, were not truly human in the sense of living a virtuous life. This was his scathing critique of the society he had rejected, a performance piece that was both absurd and deeply profound. The lamp was a symbol of his search for truth in a world he saw as being shrouded in darkness and deceit. He was a provocateur, a performance artist whose life was his greatest work of philosophy. The Cynics believed that happiness or eudaimonia came from autarky or self-sufficiency. This wasn't just about being able to feed yourself. It was about being so mentally and emotionally independent that you didn't need the approval, wealth, or power that society offered. They achieved this by deliberately choosing poverty and discomfort, a process known as ascesis, which is the root of our word asceticism. This wasn't a punishment, but a training regimen for the soul. They believed that by becoming tough and resilient, you could become invulnerable to the slings and arrows of fortune. You might have seen a follower of Diogenes deliberately going without food for a day, or sleeping in the open in a storm, all to prove to himself that he could endure and that his happiness did not depend on external comforts. This was a philosophy of radical self-reliance, a kind of extreme spiritual boot camp. Diogenes was not a solitary figure even though he rejected society. He had a strong following, and the Cynic school spread quickly throughout the Greek world. These followers, known as Cynics, lived a similar lifestyle of poverty and open defiance. They were the punks of the ancient world, an anti-establishment movement that rejected the very foundations of the social order. They believed that true virtue was a simple and attainable thing, a matter of will and character, not a complex web of intellectual theories. This was their key difference from the more academic philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. While Plato was theorizing about the ideal state, the Cynics were demonstrating with their lives that the best way to live was to be a citizen of no city but a citizen of the cosmos. An interesting and little-known detail about Diogenes is his famous encounter with Alexander the Great. The story goes that Alexander, who had heard of the great philosopher, came to visit him. He found Diogenes lounging outside his jar. Alexander, standing over him, asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes, without even sitting up, replied, "Yes, you can step out of my sunlight." Alexander was so impressed by this man's utter disregard for his power that he supposedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." This story is likely apocryphal, but it speaks to the power of the Cynics' lifestyle, the way they could disarm even the most powerful men with their radical indifference. It's a classic example of a philosophical truth being more powerful than military might. The Cynics' life, however, was not without its darker side. Their radical rejection of all social norms often led them to be seen as nuisances, and they were frequently harassed and beaten. They lived on the margins of society, and their lives were often short and brutal. The life of a Cynic was a constant struggle for survival, a philosophical choice that came with a heavy physical price. But for them, this was the point. The hardship was a test, a way to prove that their commitment to virtue was absolute. They believed that a life of ease and comfort was a life of intellectual and spiritual slavery, and they would rather be free in a doghouse than a slave in a palace. The legacy of the Cynics is a matter of ongoing debate. Were they truly philosophers, or were they simply beggars who used philosophy as a justification for their way of life? Historians still debate whether their extreme lifestyle was a genuine path to virtue or a kind of performance art designed to shock and provoke. The truth is likely a bit of both. They were certainly a nuisance to the polite society of their time, but they also asked some of the most profound questions about what it means to live a good life. They challenged the very notion of what a philosopher should be, arguing that a true philosopher wasn't a man with a head full of theories, but a man who lived his truth no matter the cost. They were a powerful and necessary corrective to the more academic schools of the day, a reminder that philosophy wasn't just for the wealthy and the well-educated. It was for anyone who had the courage to live without compromise. The dust of the Cynics' pathos settles, and you find yourself in a world that is not so different from our own, a world of political upheaval, constant warfare, and widespread anxiety. Alexander the Great's empire has fragmented, and the Greek world is a collection of warring kingdoms. The old certainties are gone, and people are searching for a new way to live, a new source of peace in a turbulent age. Into this chaos steps a new school of thought, one that promises not radical poverty or an escape from society, but a kind of inner fortress that no external force can breach. This is the philosophy of the Stoics. The term Stoic comes from the stoa poikile, or painted porch, a public colonnade in Athens where the school's founder Zeno of Citium and his followers gathered to teach and debate. Unlike Plato's exclusive academy or Aristotle's research-focused Lyceum, the Stoa was a public space open to everyone. This was a core tenet of Stoicism. Philosophy wasn't just for the elite, it was a practical guide for all of humanity. You would have seen merchants, soldiers, slaves, and statesmen all standing together listening to the teachings of Zeno. The great Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius would later become a Stoic, as would the former slave Epictetus, a testament to the philosophy's universal appeal. It was a philosophy for every man, a sort of life hack. For the soul that promised tranquility regardless of your circumstances, a day in the life of a Stoic was a constant practice of their core principles. The central idea of Stoicism is the distinction between what you can control and what you cannot. You can control your thoughts, your judgments, and your actions. You cannot control the weather, the opinions of others, or the whims of fate. The Stoics' goal was to focus all of their energy on what was in their power and to accept what wasn't with a calm and rational mind. You would have started your day by reminding yourself of this truth. You might have repeated a short mantra, a kind of mental conditioning, to prepare yourself for the day's challenges. For example, you might say to yourself, "Today I will meet with people who are ungrateful, arrogant, and deceitful. I will not be upset by this, for they do not know any better. They are a product of their nature. A funny and a little dark practice, but it was designed to inoculate you against the inevitable frustrations of life." The Stoics believed that the only thing that was truly good was virtue, and the only thing that was truly bad was vice. Everything else, wealth, health, fame, poverty, and sickness, was indifferent. This didn't mean they didn't value these things, but they saw them as preferred indifference. You would, of course, prefer to be healthy than sick and wealthy than poor. But you would not allow the loss of these things to destroy your inner peace because they are not what defines your worth. This was a radical idea in a society that was obsessed with status and fortune. It was a kind of spiritual martial art, a way of training your mind to be unshakable in the face of life's blows. You would have spent your day practicing these principles. You might find yourself in a heated argument in the marketplace, but instead of losing your temper, you would pause, take a deep breath, and analyze the situation from a detached, rational perspective. You would ask yourself, is this truly in my control? Is this anger serving me? The Stoics were not emotionless robots. They simply believed that emotions should be a guide, not a master. They believed that by training your reason, you could turn even the most negative emotions into a source of wisdom. This was their path to ataraxia, a state of tranquility and freedom from mental disturbance. An interesting and lesser-known aspect of Stoicism is its deep connection to a natural deterministic worldview. The Stoics believed that the universe was governed by a divine reason, or logos, and that everything happened for a purpose in a perfect causal chain. This meant that nothing was truly random and that even the greatest misfortunes were a part of a larger rational cosmic plan. You would have meditated on this not to become fatalistic, but to find a sense of peace in the order of the universe. This was a form of cosmic therapy, a way of seeing your own life not as a series of random events, but as a meaningful part of an interconnected whole. It's an idea that still resonates with people today, a kind of secular spirituality. The Stoics' teachings were not just theoretical, they were meant to be applied to every single aspect of life. They wrote about everything from how to deal with grief to how to be a good friend. They believed that a good life was a life lived in accordance with nature, which meant a life of reason, justice, courage, and temperance. They were a bit like ancient self-help gurus, but with a much more rigorous philosophical foundation. They encouraged a kind of daily journaling, a practice of writing down your thoughts and analyzing your actions, which is a habit that many of us still find valuable today. It's a way of holding yourself accountable, of constantly striving to be a better person. The Stoic life, however, was not one of grim resignation. It was a life of action, a life of engagement. They believed that we all have a role to play in the community, and that our duty is to do our part with virtue and reason. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, embodied this perfectly. He spent his life fighting wars, governing an empire, and dealing with political intrigue, all while writing his philosophical reflections in his book, Meditations. He was a man of immense power who chose to live a life of incredible discipline and humility, a man who saw his role not as a privilege but as a responsibility. This is a point of academic debate that still exists. Is the true Stoic meant to withdraw from society to find peace? Or is he meant to be a man of the world using his principles to do good? The Roman Stoics at least seem to have found a way to do both. As you reflect on the Stoic way of life, you realize its enduring power. It's a philosophy that doesn't promise to solve all your problems, but it promises to give you the tools to face them with dignity and strength. It's a philosophy that teaches you that your happiness is not dependent on the whims of the world, but on the strength of your own character. It's a philosophy that turns your mind into a fortress, a place where you can find peace even when the world outside is in flames. It's a quiet internal revolution, and its echoes can be heard in the way we talk about resilience and mental toughness today. You are leaving the bustling Stoa now, and you are being led down a quiet, unassuming street just outside of Athens. The air feels different here. It's softer, more gentle. The sound of the city fades into a pleasant hum. You are not going to a public space or a formal school, but to a private garden, a sanctuary from the world's chaos. This is the Garden of Epicurus, and its philosophy is a radical departure from the disciplined asceticism of the Stoics or the austere intellectualism of the Academy. The Epicureans, as they were called, sought not virtue for its own sake, but pleasure, a word that has been wildly misunderstood for millennia. The founder Epicurus was a man who, like the Stoics, sought to find a path to happiness in a tumultuous world. But his path was not one of enduring hardship, it was one of avoiding pain and seeking tranquility. The popular image of the Epicureans is one of debauched revelry and gluttonous feasting. The phrase eat, drink, and be merry is often and incorrectly attributed to them. In reality, the Epicurean lifestyle was one of radical simplicity and moderation. For Epicurus, the highest form of pleasure was not a wild party, but a quiet, peaceful state of mind and body, what he called ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance, and aponia, freedom from physical pain. You would have found him and his followers living a simple communal life, sharing a diet of bread, cheese, and water. A funny detail, Epicurus's most famous quote about food was, "Send me some cheese so that I may have a feast whenever I wish." A feast for him was a piece of cheese and bread, which really puts our modern definition of a feast in perspective. A day in the life of an Epicurean was centered around the pursuit of these simple, lasting pleasures. The most important pleasure for them was friendship. The garden was not just a school, it was a community, a chosen family. You would have spent your days talking with your friends, sharing simple meals, and discussing philosophy. They believed that the greatest source of happiness was having a close-knit group of friends you could trust and rely on. The conversations weren't abstract debates about forms or logic, but practical discussions about how to live a good life, how to overcome fear, and how to find peace. The garden was a safe space, a haven from the political turmoil of the outside world, a place where you could be yourself without fear of judgment. The philosophy of Epicurus was designed to eliminate the two greatest sources of human suffering: fear of the gods and fear of death. Epicurus believed that the gods existed, but he also believed they were too perfect and detached to care about human affairs. Therefore, there was no reason to fear their wrath. The gods were not going to punish you or meddle in your life. This was a radical idea in a world where people were constantly trying to appease angry deities. As for the fear of death, Epicurus had a simple, elegant solution. Death is nothing to us, and he famously said, "For when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist." He believed that all of our fears and anxieties about death came from the belief that there was an afterlife filled with punishment, or from the fear of the unknown. By removing these fears, he hoped to free people from a lifetime of anxiety and allow them to enjoy the simple pleasures of the present. The Epicurean life was one of quiet contemplation, but it was not one of intellectual laziness. They had their own unique approach to philosophy, one that was highly materialistic. They believed that the universe was made up of atoms and void, and that the soul was also made of fine atoms that dispersed upon death. This was a form of ancient science, a way of understanding the world that eliminated the need for divine intervention or supernatural explanations. By understanding the world in this way, they believed they could live without superstition and fear. It was a philosophy grounded in rationalism, but its ultimate goal was not abstract knowledge. It was practical happiness. An interesting and little-known fact about the Epicurean garden is that it was one of the few places in ancient Greece where women and slaves were welcomed as equals. Unlike the exclusive male-dominated philosophical schools of the time, Epicurus's community was open to everyone who was committed to the philosophical way of life. This was a radical social experiment, a deliberate rejection of the rigid hierarchies of Athenian society. In the garden, the master and the slave, The man and the woman all sat together as friends equals in their pursuit of happiness. This fact is a testament to the core belief of Epicureanism, that the simple human connections we make are more important than our social status or our wealth. It's a point of academic debate whether this social inclusivity was a political statement or simply a natural outcome of their focus on friendship and tranquility. The life of an Epicurean was not just about sitting around and being happy, however. It required a disciplined approach to pleasure. You had to learn to distinguish between different types of desires, natural and necessary, like food and shelter natural, but unnecessary, like gourmet food, or luxurious clothes, and unnatural and unnecessary, like fame or power. The Epicureans believed that by focusing on fulfilling the first category of desires and ignoring the other two, you could achieve a state of lasting peace. They were in a way teaching a kind of ancient mindfulness, a way of being content with what you have and not constantly striving for more. The legacy of Epicureanism is a complex one. Because the word pleasure was in their philosophy, they were often smeared by their opponents as hedonists, and their reputation suffered for centuries. It's a classic case of a philosophical idea being twisted for political gain, but their true legacy is in their radical humanism. They taught that our happiness is in our own hands, that we can find peace by cultivating friendship, eliminating fear, and living a simple life. They were the philosophers of the quiet life, the gentle life, the life of connection and contentment. As you stand in the garden, you feel a sense of calm you haven't felt anywhere else. You realize that the greatest treasure is not a full purse or a powerful position, but a peaceful mind and a handful of good friends. You have been on a long journey traversing the intellectual landscapes of the Academy, the Lyceum, the Cynic's Jar, and the Epicurean Garden. Each school offered a different answer to the fundamental question of how to live a good life. But now you are being introduced to a group of thinkers who believe that all of these answers were in their own way incomplete. They didn't offer a new doctrine, a new set of truths to believe in. Instead, they offered a radical and liberating path, the path of perpetual doubt. You are now encountering the skeptics. The founder of this school was Pyrrho of Elis, a philosopher who traveled with Alexander the Great's army all the way to India. He was deeply influenced by the Eastern philosophies he encountered there, particularly the idea of non-attachment and the futility of dogmatic belief. Upon his return, he founded a school of thought that was, in a sense, an anti-school. The skeptics didn't have a set of beliefs to teach. They had a method for questioning all beliefs. Their goal was not to find the truth, but to find serenity in the absence of it. They believed that the constant search for certainty, the endless debates about the nature of reality or the gods, were the source of all human anxiety. By suspending judgment on all matters, they believed they could achieve a state of mental peace or ataraxia, similar to the Epicureans, but arrived at through a very different path. A day in the life of a skeptic was a constant practice of suspending judgment. You would have seen them listening to an argument, a fiery debate between a Stoic and an Epicurean, and instead of taking a side, they would simply state that the evidence was insufficient to come to a firm conclusion. They would use a technique called isostheneia, or equipoise, where they would weigh the arguments for and against a position and find that they were equally compelling, leading them to a state of indecision. This was not an intellectual cop-out. It was a disciplined philosophical choice. They believed that by refusing to commit to any single belief, they could be free from the anger, frustration, and fear that came with defending a position. If you don't believe in anything absolutely, then no one can attack your beliefs. You can't be wrong. It's a very clever and for many a very frustrating way of engaging with the world. The skeptic's life was not one of passive acceptance, however. They were still able to function in the world. They lived their lives according to what seemed most plausible at the moment, following the customs and traditions of their society without necessarily believing them to be the ultimate truth. You would have seen a skeptic participating in a religious festival, not because they believed in the gods, but because it was the custom to do so. They would eat a meal not because they had a firm belief in the nature of nutrition, but because they were hungry. Their philosophy was a way of living that allowed them to navigate the world without the burden of having to be right about everything. It's a bit like driving a car. You don't need a PhD in automotive engineering to drive it. You just need to know how to follow the rules of the road. An interesting and little-known detail about the skeptics is that they were not always seen as the serene, tranquil figures they aspired to be. Some of their opponents, including Stoics and Epicureans, would argue that their philosophy was a kind of intellectual laziness, a refusal to do the hard work of finding the truth. They would argue that a person who truly believed nothing would be unable to act, that they would be a kind of human automaton. The skeptics, however, would counter that they were able to act in the world, but their actions were not based on dogmatic belief. They were based on what they called phenomena or appearances, the simple observable facts of the world. They would act on the appearance that food nourished them, that fire burned them, and that friendship was a good thing even if they couldn't prove that these things were the ultimate objective truth. It's a distinction that can feel a bit like hair splitting, but for them it was the key to their intellectual freedom. The life of a skeptic was a constant training of the mind to let go of its need for certainty. They would use a variety of techniques to achieve this. One of their most famous arguments was a logical paradox called the liar's paradox, in which a statement, "this statement is false," is shown to be impossible to definitively prove as either true or false. By engaging with these kinds of logical puzzles, they hoped to show that even the most rigorous intellectual systems could be thrown into doubt. This was a kind of philosophical therapy, a way of training the mind to be comfortable with ambiguity. A funny detail, one of the famous anecdotes about Pyrrho, is that he was so committed to his philosophy that he would not move to avoid an obstacle like a runaway cart because he wasn't sure if it was a real threat. His friends had to constantly save him from danger, which is a bit of a problem for a philosophy that is supposed to lead to a good life. Historians still debate whether this anecdote is true or if it was simply a caricature created by his opponents to discredit his philosophy. The legacy of the skeptics is a deep and enduring one. While they were not a mainstream school of thought for long, their ideas would go on to influence thinkers for centuries, from the Roman orator Cicero to the French philosopher Montaigne. Their core belief that we should be cautious about claiming to have the ultimate truth and that we should be humble in the face of what we don't know is a powerful one. They were the philosophers of humility, the thinkers who taught us that sometimes the most profound wisdom is simply admitting, "I don't know." In a world that is still full of people who are absolutely certain that they are right, the skeptic's quiet doubt is a refreshing and a much-needed reminder that maybe, just maybe, the answer to the good life is not in finding the right answer, but in learning to be okay without one. As you step away from the unsettling certainty of the skeptics, you find yourself in a different kind of space, one that is not a school or a garden, but a bustling medical ward. The air smells of herbs, incense, and the faint, coppery scent of blood. You are seeing a side of ancient Greek life that is often overlooked in the grand narratives of philosophy and war, the world of medicine. But even here in the practical hands-on world of healing, the philosophers are present. This is a crucial but often forgotten link in the chain of Greek thought, the profound connection between philosophy and the healing arts. The most famous figure in ancient Greek medicine is Hippocrates, a man who is often called the father of medicine. He was not a philosopher in the traditional sense, but his approach to medicine was deeply philosophical. He rejected the prevailing belief that disease was a punishment from the gods or the work of malevolent spirits. Instead, he argued that disease had natural causes, and that it could be understood and treated through observation and rational thought. This was a radical break from superstition, a scientific and philosophical leap that laid the foundation for modern medicine. You would have seen his followers, the Hippocratics, meticulously documenting the symptoms of a patient, their diet, their environment, and the progression of their illness. They believed that the body was a complex system of humors, blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors. The goal of the physician was to restore this balance not with magic or prayer, but with diet rest and natural remedies. A funny detail, the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors still swear to today, includes a promise not to give a woman an abortive remedy, which shows that a doctor's ethical dilemmas are as old as the profession itself. But the link between philosophy and medicine went deeper than just a shared commitment to rational thought. Many of the great philosophers of the age were also practicing physicians, or at least deeply interested in the human body. Aristotle, the meticulous observer of nature, wrote extensively on anatomy and biology. He believed that the human body was a perfect example of a system with a purpose, a microcosm of the rational order of the universe. He dissected animals and documented their anatomy, and his writings on the subject would be the standard text for over 1,000 years. For Aristotle, studying the body was not separate from studying philosophy. It was a way of understanding the fundamental principles of life itself. The body was a living, breathing testament to the power of reason and the beauty of a world that was ordered and knowable. The Stoics, too, had a medical philosophy. They believed that the mind and body were interconnected, and that a healthy mind was essential for a healthy body. They saw emotions as a kind of illness, a sickness of the soul that could be cured with reason. They believed that the best way to prevent sickness was to live a life of virtue and moderation, a life that was not a slave to the passions of the body. You would have seen a Stoic using philosophy as a kind of medicine, a way of diagnosing and treating the afflictions of the mind. They would use logical arguments to calm a person's fear or reasoned discourse to help a person deal with grief. The goal of the Stoic was to be an emotional physician, a healer of the soul. The Epicureans, as we've seen, also had a philosophy that was deeply concerned with the body. They believed that the greatest good was the absence of pain or aponia. Their philosophy was a kind of preventative medicine, a way of living that would minimize the chances of both physical and mental suffering. They believed that by eating a simple diet, avoiding excesses, and cultivating a peaceful mind, they could live a long and healthy life. For them, a doctor's role was not just to treat disease, but to teach people how to live a life that would prevent it in the first place. The garden was, in a sense, a wellness center, a place where people learned how to be both happy and healthy. An interesting and little-known detail about this period is the deep debate among historians about the exact nature of the relationship between these two fields. While it is clear that they were intertwined, the academic debate continues on whether philosophy was seen as a kind of higher medicine, healing the soul, or if medicine was seen as a kind of applied philosophy, using reason to understand the body. The truth is likely that they saw them as two sides of the same coin, two different paths to the same goal, a good and healthy life. The most famous example of this is the idea of psychosomatic illness, the belief that the mind could affect the body and vice versa. This was not a new idea in ancient Greece. It was a core tenet of their medical philosophy. They believed that an unvirtuous or an unhappy life could make you sick, and that a life of reason and virtue could make you healthy. The legacy of this connection is still with us today. The very idea of a doctor who treats the whole person, who takes into account not just the physical symptoms but also the patient's lifestyle and mental state, has its roots in ancient Greece. The idea that a healthy mind is essential for a healthy body is not just a New Age cliché. It's a profound philosophical truth that has been with us for millennia. As you leave the medical ward, you realize that the boundaries between these different fields of human inquiry were much more fluid in ancient Greece than they are today. The philosopher was not just a thinker. He was a kind of doctor, a healer of the soul. And the doctor was not just a healer. He was a kind of philosopher, a man who used reason and observation to understand the deepest mysteries of life. The two were inextricably linked, two different paths to the same goal, to live a life that was not just long, but also good and healthy. You've spent this entire journey with men, a lot of them with beards, and most of them with strong opinions. This is the traditional narrative of ancient Greek philosophy, a world of men debating in public spaces, writing books, and founding schools. But the story is not complete without looking beyond this male-dominated facade to the lives of the women who, against immense social and legal restrictions, were also a part of this intellectual revolution. You are now entering a different kind of space, a private home, a salon, a philosophical circle where women were not just an afterthought, but a vital part of the conversation. This is the world of women in philosophy. In ancient Athens, women of a certain social standing were largely confined to the home, their lives revolving around domestic duties and raising children. They were not citizens and had very few legal rights. They were in many ways an invisible part of public life. But philosophy in its own way was a kind of private life. and in some circles, women found a space to participate. The most famous example of this is a group of highly educated and often foreign-born women known as hetairai or companions. Unlike the cloistered lives of Athenian wives, the hetairai were free to move about the city to attend symposia, intellectual drinking parties, and to engage in conversation with the most brilliant minds of the day. One of the most famous of these women was Aspasia of Miletus, the partner of the great Athenian statesman Pericles. She was not just a beautiful companion, she was an intellectual force in her own right. Plato and other philosophers of the day spoke of her with immense respect. She was said to be a brilliant speaker and a skilled rhetorician, and there is a strong academic debate about whether she may have had a hand in writing some of Pericles' most famous speeches. You would have found her in her home holding a salon where the most brilliant minds of Athens, including Socrates himself, would gather to talk philosophy, politics, and art. She was a kind of intellectual hub, a woman who, in a society that valued women for their silence, was revered for her intelligence and her voice. But the women in philosophy were not just hetairai. In some of the more radical philosophical schools, women were welcomed as equals. We've already touched on the Epicurean garden, a place where men and women, slaves and citizens, were all part of the same philosophical community. The founder Epicurus was very clear about this, and his school was a true social experiment. Women like Leontian, an Epicurean philosopher and companion of Epicurus, were known to write and teach philosophy, and their work was held in high regard. A funny detail, one of the more salacious rumors about the Epicurean garden, was that it was a place of wild orgies. But the reality was likely a group of friends sharing bread and cheese, which is a pretty good example of how a woman's presence in a philosophical circle was enough to be seen as scandalous. The Cynics, too, had women among their ranks. Hipparchia of Maronea was a Cynic philosopher who famously left a life of wealth and privilege to live with her husband Crates in the Cynic lifestyle. She wore the rough cloak of a Cynic, lived in the streets, and debated philosophy with the men of the day. When she was challenged by a man who said it was not her place to be a philosopher, she famously replied, "Do you think that I have made a wrong choice for myself if, in order to live in the best way, I have given up the pursuits of a woman?" She was a fierce, uncompromising woman who proved with her life that a woman could be a philosopher just as well as a man could. She was a living, breathing testament to the Cynic ideal of living a life of virtue, unburdened by the conventions of society. The Pythagoreans, a philosophical and religious sect founded by Pythagoras, were also a group where women played a significant role. The sect believed in the transmigration of souls, and in a way they saw women as equals in their spiritual journey. Theano, the wife of Pythagoras, was herself a philosopher and a teacher, and many other women were part of the community. They studied mathematics, music, and philosophy alongside the men. This was a radical departure from the norm of the time, a place where a woman's intellectual capacity was valued and respected. This is a point of academic debate that still lingers. Were these women the exception or the rule? Were they simply anomalies, or were they a sign of a deeper, more widespread female intellectual life that has been erased from the historical record? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. We only have fragments of their lives and their work. But what we do have is a powerful reminder that philosophy was not just a male endeavor. Women were there on the fringes and in the centers, in the gardens and in the salons, contributing their voices and their ideas to the great conversation about how to live a good life. As you reflect on the lives of these women, you realize something profound. Their greatest philosophical act was not what they said, but how they lived. Their very existence as philosophers in a patriarchal society was a kind of living, breathing philosophical argument. They were arguing for their own humanity, for their right to think, to speak, and to live a life of the mind. They were living proof that wisdom has no gender, no social status, and no nationality. They were the unsung heroes of this story, the women who, in a world that sought to silence them, chose to philosophize with their lives. Their voices, though often faint, are a vital part of the chorus of Greek philosophy, and their legacy is a testament to the fact that the pursuit of truth is a universal human desire. The journey is almost at an end. You have walked with Socrates through the agora, sat with Plato in his grove, and strolled with Aristotle in his peripatetic school. You have seen the cynic in his jar, the stoic in his porch, the Epicurean in his garden, and the skeptic in his quiet indecision. You have also peered into the hidden world of women philosophers, the unsung heroes of this intellectual odyssey. But as you stand here at the end of this long history, you realize that this is not just a history of the past, it is a history of the present. The ideas of these ancient thinkers did not die with them. They are still with us echoing in the halls of your life today. The legacy of these philosophers is not just in the books you might read or the classes you might take. It is in the very fabric of your world. When a scientist sets out to prove a hypothesis, they are following in the footsteps of Aristotle, the great observer and classifier of the natural world. When a politician debates a law, they are, for better or worse, using a form of logic that was invented in the Lyceum. The idea of a university, a place where people from all walks of life can come together to learn and debate, is a direct inheritance from Plato's Academy. The very concept of rational thought, of using reason to solve problems, has its roots in the philosophy of Socrates. But the legacy is more personal than that. You find it in your daily life, in the small decisions you make, and the way you think about the world. When you tell yourself to just get over it after a setback, you are channeling the core principle of Stoicism, the idea that you should focus on what you can control and accept what you cannot. The Stoic emphasis on resilience, on mental toughness, on seeing a challenge not as a tragedy but as an opportunity for growth, is a powerful force in our modern culture. We see it in self-help books and therapy, and in the way we talk about personal growth. The Stoics would be thrilled and a little amused to see that their philosophy has become the kind of everyday wisdom that we now take for granted. The Cynic's influence is also alive and well. The idea of radical authenticity, of living a simple life that is unburdened by the demands of consumerism and social status, is a core tenet of modern minimalism. When you see someone who has deliberately chosen to live with less to reject the trappings of wealth and fame, you are seeing a modern cynic, a person who has chosen to find happiness not in having more, but in needing less. The Cynics were the original punks, the original anti-establishment thinkers, and their legacy is in every person who chooses to live a life that is true to themselves, no matter what society expects of them. The Epicureans' influence, too, is a quiet but powerful one. The idea that happiness is found in simple pleasures and friendship and in a peaceful mind is a timeless truth. When you choose to have a quiet dinner with a few close friends instead of a large, raucous party, you are embracing the Epicurean ideal. When you choose to step away from the chaos of your phone and social media to find a moment of peace, you are seeking the ataraxia that Epicurus and his followers so valued. The Epicurean legacy is a gentle reminder that the good life is not a life of excess, but a life of contentment, a life of quiet joy. The skeptic's legacy perhaps is the most profound of all. In an age of information overload where we are bombarded with competing claims and conflicting truths, the skeptic's advice is more relevant than ever. The idea that you should be cautious about what you believe, that you should suspend judgment until you have sufficient evidence, is the very foundation of critical thinking. The skeptic's voice is the voice of reason in a world of certainty, a quiet, gentle reminder that it is okay to say, "I don't know." The skeptics gave us the gift of intellectual humility, a humility that is the first step toward true wisdom. The history of these philosophers is not just a history of their thoughts, but a history of their lives. They were not just thinkers, they were human beings who were trying to figure out how to live. They were soldiers and teachers, husbands and wives, public figures and private hermits. They were men and women who were in their own way on a journey to find what it means to be human. And so as the final echoes of their voices fade, you are left alone in the quiet. The journey is over, but the conversation is just beginning. The philosophical questions they asked are still being asked today, and the answers they found are still being debated. The good life, as they taught us, is not a destination. It is a journey that you are on right now, with every thought you think, every choice you make, and every moment you choose to reflect on the meaning of it all. The legacy of these ancient Greek philosophers is not just a set of ideas. It is a way of living, and it is a gift that they gave to us, a gift that we can choose to open every single day. The room is still. The faint hum of the fan is a comforting presence. The journey is over and the stories have been told. Your mind is quiet now, filled not with answers, but with the gentle, lingering questions of the philosophers. Their debates, their struggles, their quiet moments of reflection, they all fade into a soft, warm haze. The world outside is still there, but for a moment it feels distant, a distant echo of the philosophical journey you've just taken. The light from the window is fading, turning the room into a peaceful, dark sanctuary. The noise of the day is gone, replaced by the deep silence of the night. It's a silence that is not empty, but full of the quiet wisdom of centuries. And in that silence, you can finally rest,